Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my public accountability meeting. I'm Zoe Metcalfe. I'm the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner for North Yorkshire and York. So turning to my agenda now, agenda item number 1, attendance and apologies. So we have 2 apologies, which is Lindsay Butterfield, and also a partial apology from Simon Dennis, who will join us later. Agenda item 2 is the minutes of the previous meeting and any actions. So the minutes from the previous meeting are recorded and published on the OPFCC website. There are no actions or updates to record. Agenda item 3. So we have a question from the public, which I'm going to read out, but we're actually going to cover off this in the fire presentation on agenda item 6. So the question is from Julie. And it is, I'm wondering if you might explain, if possible, just what it takes to see where a trend is occurring in cases of fire, please. Thank you. So we'll cover that off in agenda item 6. So now can I turn to agenda item 4, which is North Yorkshire Police Anti-Social Behaviour presentation by Ed Haywood-Noble. So over to you, Ed. Thank you. Ed, you're just on mute.
Apologies. Thanks for that. I always struggle with the mute button. I'll just bring my presentation up and then I'll begin the slideshow. Just one moment while I bring it up. I'm just going to have to go click through and then go back to the start. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ed Haywood-Noble. I'm the Superintendent for the Partnership Hub in North Yorkshire Police, and the department covers a wide remit of responsibilities, including things such as alcohol licensing, problem solving, mental health, drugs, and the whole special constabulary and citizens in policing agenda as well. And among our work that we do, we work very, very closely with neighbourhood policing teams within North Yorkshire Police, particularly on issues such as antisocial behaviour, taking a problem-solving approach. And I'll go into this in more detail, but the idea is very much around getting to the root of problems and taking a long-term problem-solving approach to prevent them happening again, reducing harm that way, and also so that we're not getting then into cycles of repeat calling where people are having to call on ourselves and partners time and again for help. So the approach that we want to adopt is very much around long-term problem-solving. So my presentation is going to cover the following points this afternoon. First of all, a bit of background and context. Then I've got some statistics just to give an overview of antisocial behaviour in North Yorkshire, who it affects and where it's most prevalent. Then I'll talk a bit around some strengths that we've got as an organisation, also working in partnership with other organisations around what's going well. And then some challenges that have been identified in terms of things that I think that we need to address some points, and then opportunities to overcome those challenges, so the way that we're going to deal with those. And then I'll just summarise at the end with my last slide, which is around just the aims, the opportunities that we plan to pursue, and then what we intend to achieve in terms of results in the next 12 months and beyond that as well. So a bit of background and context to start with. So antisocial behaviour is defined as behaviour by a person which causes or is likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress to one or more persons not of the same household as the person who's responsible for it. And it can include a whole range of behaviour, including some of those on the screen there. So littering, vandalism, nuisance, drunkenness, noise and abusive behaviours, which can cause misery to an individual or to the wider community. And we don't underestimate the impact that antisocial behaviour can have on individuals and on our communities as well. And that's why we take the response to it really, really seriously, because we want to reduce.
Sorry to interrupt. I think your slide seems to be stuck on your aims and results at the end. It did flick through, right, and it seems to skip back to the end.
Oh, thanks, Tom. Sorry. What I'll do, I'll just try sharing again. Sorry, and I'll try and put that. So has that come up on background and context now?
It has, yes.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks for keeping me right. As we go through, if it skips to the wrong one again, if you could just let me know, I'd really appreciate that. So just really going through this slide just to explain, these are the different range of things that antisocial behaviour can take, the different forms it can take, but we recognise that it can have a real negative impact on people's quality of life when they're affected by it, which is why we take it really, really seriously. Using the legislation there at the bottom of the slide that's was brought in 2014 to tackle antisocial behaviour and to act as a deterrent for perpetrators as well. So just moving on to the next slide then, just some recognition, again, in terms of background, that antisocial behaviour can have a ripple effect across communities, and the root causes of it can be complex. No single agency, including the police, can solve this alone. It needs a partnership approach with ourselves, local government partners, healthcare, etc., in order to address antisocial behaviour and get those long-term solutions that I was talking about at the start. And success in resolving antisocial behaviour then builds confidence in public services, which is essential for us to have the trust and confidence of our communities. So moving on to the partnership approach, there are 7 community safety hubs across North Yorkshire and the City of York. We're staffed by district council staff, police officers and partner agencies as well. They're co-located to ensure a closer problem-solving approach in tackling local priority issues, which include antisocial behaviour and everything else that requires a partnership approach across the county and the City of York. So the hubs are responsible for developing and implementing initiatives to assist with local issues involving individuals and groups, and using issues, mechanisms such as problem-solving plans to address those issues, which can be bespoke to deal with that particular problem or whatever it may be that's manifesting. So the North Yorkshire approach, this is sort of takes it down to where antisocial behaviour sits within North Yorkshire Police. So we've got the various priorities for the force, and antisocial behaviour of all types sits under community harm there, which is a responsibility of the partnership hub, but also with very much closely supporting the neighbourhood policing teams with that approach to ASB. And there's some close links as well to some of the other priorities that we've got there from antisocial behaviour, particularly around some of the nighttime economy work that we're doing as well to ensure that people feel safe when they're out and about in the nighttime environment. So just some statistics now, just to give the data for antisocial behaviour across North Yorkshire. And I've broken this down into 3 different types, which you can see there. So environmental on the blue line, nuisance on the red line, and then personal antisocial behaviour on the green line there. And the difference between them, environmental, this is the interface between people and places, and it includes incidents where people, individuals and groups have an impact on their surroundings, including the natural habitat and built and social environments as well. Nuisance, this captures incidents where an act or condition, thing or person causes trouble or annoyance or inconvenience or offence or suffering to local community in general, rather than to individual victims. And then antisocial behaviour, the personal category, this is where an individual has or themselves, including the call or the call handler, perceives them as being targeted, either as an individual or a group, rather than the community at large. So you can see from the slide there that the biggest fall in antisocial behaviour reporting has been on the environmental side, but we've also seen reductions across nuisance and personal as well, although the personal category has stayed more constant. And we can see that nuisance tends to peak in the summer months, sort of June, July time, which is potentially linked to things like parties, the better weather, that kind of thing, people being outside and causing noise nuisance, that kind of thing to their neighbours. So this shows the geographical spread of antisocial behaviour reports. I've broken it down into the 12-month data on the left-hand side and 3 years worth of data on the right-hand side. This shows, say, the whole county and the City of York as well. And you can see from the slide there where reports are concentrated very much in the urban areas of Harrogate, York and Scarborough, with some in Selby area as well. And so there's not been a massive change in the data between the 3 years and the 12 months. It stayed relatively consistent, being concentrated in the urban areas. And so this is where neighbourhood policing teams and the community safety hubs focus their efforts, operations and prevention ill intervention. It does, however, also raise a question, which I'll come on to later, around, are we getting full reporting from people who live in the rural areas? Do they feel that they're comfortable reporting antisocial behaviour to us? That's something that I'll say that I'll come on to on a later slide.
Ed, Tom's got a question for you, and so do I actually. Tom?
Thanks, Zoe. So Ed, just on your previous slide, it really, I guess we always come across this issue really when we do heat mapping, which includes City or Harrogate and Scarborough. Obviously, the comparative volumes compared to some of our more rural areas always skews what the map looks like at the end of the day, doesn't it? Which isn't to deny the volume that exists in those locations, but it tends to mean that our other areas don't register, as you say, and obviously there is a question around reporting there. But I think I'm going to just reinforce, I think, what you've alluded to there, that there's a recognition that antisocial behaviour does exist in other places. We're not saying it doesn't exist in other places from this map. And I wondered if, because we hear quite a bit about that in the office. So it clearly does exist. So I just wanted to make sure we were recognising that this isn't the whole picture.
Absolutely, Tom. I think you've articulated really what I was trying to get across there, that there is that recognition that antisocial behaviour isn't just something that affects urban communities, it is something that we see in rural areas as well, although, as you say, the heat maps don't necessarily reflect that.
Thank you, Tom. My question is about, are there any short and long-term plans for dealing with the antisocial behaviour in those particular areas that we can see that seem quite permanent?
If I may, Commissioner, I'll come on to that on my later slides. I've got some detail of what works in terms of the strengths that we've got, which I'll be able to give you some detail on that as we move through the presentation, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. So just following on from the last slide, this gives a bit more detail of the urban centres and the antisocial behaviour reports, sort of going down a level, if you like, into more detail. So Harrogate on the top there, York on the left, and Scarborough on the right. And you can see from those slides that it's very much the town and city centres that where we've seen the bulk of reports. Equally, as we alluded to with the last slide, that doesn't mean that antisocial behaviour isn't happening in other areas. It's just that the reports are very much concentrated in the town and city centres. But also we can see that, for example, in Harrogate, there's some reports to the west of the town and also over on the east side in Starbeck and Knaresborough. In York, on the western side of the city as well, around Acombe area, there's a bit of a bulk there. And similarly in Scarborough, just sort of around some of the town centre areas to the south of or the southwest of the town centre there. And again, what this is telling us, when we put this together with the kind of the time-based stats, is that we're seeing these reports in these geographical locations peaking in the summer months and in the good weather, which again lends itself to the theory that a lot of this is antisocial behaviour of the nuisance type, with people being out and about on the streets and that kind of thing. Moving on. I put this slide together. This is for all antisocial behaviour incidents that have a prejudice qualifier. And I wanted to talk through this because this is around how antisocial behaviour affects underrepresented groups, some of whom are the most vulnerable in society. So the prejudice qualifier indicates when one or more of the protected characteristics is cited in an incident when it's been reported. So the bulk of this is seen in the personal category, which is the green line there on the top. And the numbers are quite small, but even though that's the case, it doesn't make this kind of prejudicial behaviour in any way acceptable. And in terms of the trends, we're not seeing a consistent picture through the year. There is a potential read across to some national events, and some of the peaks in antisocial behaviour reports coincide with key milestones, such as the Sarah Everard case, which rightly heightened awareness of women and girls' safety. And we're working very hard in North Yorkshire and also nationally with partners to address these issues. This slide, this next one here, this is overlaid the total antisocial behaviour figures with the prejudice ones. There's a different scale on the right-hand side to the left-hand side. So the left-hand side scale shows the total antisocial behaviour reports, and the right-hand scale shows the ones with prejudice. So it's not, you could interpret that slide as being in March 21, all our antisocial behaviour reports were prejudice-based, but they're not. It's just that I've used a different scale to see if there's any correlation between the two. There isn't a real obvious correlation between total antisocial behaviour reports and those where we're getting a prejudice marker, which I thought that was interesting, that inconsistency, because I would have expected there to be some sort of correlation between the two. And what that suggests to me is that perhaps there is again, some underreporting from underrepresented groups of antisocial behaviour. There's a number of possible reasons for this as well. It could be low confidence for historical reasons. It could be a lack of knowledge about reporting mechanisms, and it could be language barriers. But it's something that that needs our attention to understand that a bit more and to do something about it if we need to. This next slide details antisocial behaviour and COVID fixed penalty notices, and I thought it was worth including this because of the experience that we've been through as a country with the COVID regulations, etc. Just to get an understanding of how much antisocial behaviour during the lockdowns was as a result of the COVID fixed penalty notices. So I've put the two together on that slide. So the top line in blue is total antisocial behaviour reports, and then the second line in green is the number of fixed penalties for COVID, breach of the COVID regulations that were issued at that time. So you can see with there is quite a close correlation between the two there, which coincides with the times when the country was in lockdown. So, for example, in November 21, 30% of antisocial behaviour reports were linked to COVID, breach of the COVID regulations, whereas in February 21, it was 72%. And then in March, 37%, and in April, 10%. So it really peaked in February last year, which ties in, let's say, with the dates of the lockdowns. And as the lockdown ended and people could start to resume normal life, other types of antisocial behaviour then increased again. And I think that now that we're coming out of COVID, it's probably a good time for us to have a look at these numbers with the in partnership with the community safety hubs, just to see if there's any learning that we can take from the experience that we had going through COVID and how that impacted on our communities and our organisations. So I'll move on to the strengths now. What works well? So a problem-solving approach. We know that there's evidence nationally and even internationally that this is a really good way of dealing with antisocial behaviour and other community issues. It's about, as I said at the start, getting to the root of problems and working with partners to implement long-term solutions. And this reduces harm to victims and communities and minimises repeat calling. And this is something that we're adopting right across North Yorkshire Police at the moment for all our activity. But we're starting with neighbourhood policing in terms of taking this problem-solving approach, which is really a change of mindset for our teams, not just dealing with what we're presented with, but thinking what's really going on here, getting to the root of it, bringing partners in, listening to what we already do, listen to the victim's wishes, but really getting a sense of what's going to work in the long term to address these issues and reducing harm that way. The Neighbourhood Management Award. This is an award that it's an educational piece for our teams, and it educates them so they can provide a better response to the community issues. It's a national programme. All our neighbourhood policing colleagues have either completed it or they've signed up for it, and it increases community confidence in policing by making it professional in terms of dealing with these community concerns, and it gives staff confidence and pride in their work as well. So we know that that's delivering for us. Deep democracy. This is another tool for tackling antisocial behaviour and community issues. It involves communities understanding problems themselves and reaching solutions themselves. There was a successful pilot of this at Skelton in York, which we just evaluated. It really involved communities in reaching joint solutions. It's quite resource intensive and it doesn't work for every antisocial behaviour issue, but for certain ones where whole communities are involved, it can be really, really positive and deliver some really good results. So that's something that we're looking to extend to other areas. And then the partnership side of things as well, with North Yorkshire Police colleagues embedded in the community safety hubs. This enables joint understanding of issues and a rapid partnership response, again, to implement those long-term sustainable solutions. And then lastly, in terms of the underreporting or potential underreporting that I was talking about, we're really keen to make sure that we've got every opportunity for our community to be able to report antisocial behaviour to us in whatever way suits them. So in terms of community messenger, that's a way of keeping our communities up to date with what's happening, and we're signing people up to that all the time. And then in terms of reporting, obviously we've got WhatsApp groups and also community involvement in solving, to encourage reporting and involvement in solving problems, including antisocial behaviour. Just a quick case study here. I won't go through all the numbers in detail, but this illustrates at Ripon from April 2020 to February 2022 across the 3 wards at Ripon, antisocial behaviour reports that were coming in. It was a significant concern for the communities and for ourselves as well in the police when there was a bit of a peak in antisocial behaviour there. And so the way that it was addressed was by taking a problem-solving approach, using the SARA model in collaboration with partners, involving local communities, partners and local representatives as well. And you can see from the chart there, over time, although there were peaks and troughs, the antisocial behaviour reports decreased significantly over the period across all 3 wards, and that helped to build, again, community trust and confidence, and it proved to be successful over time. So just some specifics there around what we did.
Sorry, can I just stop you a moment, because I know Jenny's
Please.
got a question and so have I. So can you just maybe flip back a page if that's all right?
Yeah.
Jenny, can I bring you in?
Thank you, Zoe. My kind of couple of comments were just on the slide before. I just wanted to reference about that. I think the work that you mentioned in Skelton actually led to a community fund application to support the kind of the problem solving approach, which kind of ties in really well between the work that NYP and partners are doing and how it connects into the OPFCC's office. So I thought I'd just reference that. And then I just wanted to mention some of the things that we've been talking about, which is solidifying and improving those links between ASB problem solving and the Commission services. So our change direction diversion service and our crossroads diversion services, and how those can also be used in terms of kind of supporting that root cause, addressing the root causes that are identified with the problem solving approach. So I thought it was a good point to reference there in terms of the strengths work.
Definitely. Thanks for making those points, Jenny. And yeah, absolutely. And I think that's just one of the key strengths is those links across, that we're working as one team to address these issues.
So my question's on the next page, actually, of the next slide. So you refer to using the SARA model, Ed, when combating ASBs, particularly in Ripon, but yet it's very much peaks and troughs. It doesn't seem to get to the nub of the problem. So we look at Minster Ward, for instance, which is the worst affected ward for ASB, and it goes up and down, but is going back up again. So how effective is SARA long term?
I think there's a lot of evidence from within North Yorkshire Police, but also from around the country, that it is effective in the long term. There are those peaks and troughs, and I think, but if you look at the the longer term trend lines that run through those, you can see that there's a downward trend over time, and there can be all sorts of causal factors for the peaks and troughs. And I think the other thing perhaps to acknowledge is that not all the approaches that we've taken work first time. There's some learning that we take from each approach that we take. And one thing that we've developed, which has been implemented force-wide, is a dashboard for all problem-solving plans, so that we'll have a sense of what's working where and what's working in other areas as well, right across the force area, so that we can share best practice really effectively. So Ripon's quite an early one, but there'll be a lot of best practice from that and from evaluating it that we can share in other areas that have been affected by antisocial behaviour, to perhaps smooth out some of those peaks and troughs. But I think it's taking that long-term approach and seeing the long-term reductions over time. Does that answer your question, Commissioner?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. These are some of the approaches that we took, or that were taken in Ripon to address antisocial behaviour. I won't read them all out, but I'll just handpick a few. There's some quite innovative ones there in terms of things like the Stepping Up project, things like Youth Voice as well, and also obviously the diversion schemes that Jenny mentioned, which are really important to the approach as considerations. Pathway, which fall under the one at the end there, the pathway, the projects to divert offenders away from criminality as an alternative to court disposals. I think probably that one of the biggest ones is the multi-agency approach was essential to Ripon, but one thing that also was really effective there was enforcement. And using not just the antisocial behaviour powers, but also other powers that we've got to deal with these kind of issues, including Section 59 notices for vehicles that have been used in an antisocial manner, and also antisocial, the ASBO legislation as well. And there were some, I think, some convictions that came out from the efforts that the team at Ripon put in, which were really well received within the community and built significant trust and confidence there. So I wouldn't recommend using all these measures for every single antisocial behaviour report that we get, but it gives us a menu, if you like, that we can pick from, so that then it's tailored, the response is tailored to whatever the issue is that we're dealing with, so that we can give the best possible service to our communities. So some of the challenges that I've identified, I think there's something around updates to officers on the victim services that are available to victims of antisocial behaviour. But I think that's not something that's there's been a bit of a change in landscape with that, and victims haven't always been of antisocial behaviour, I should stress that, have not always been automatically referred to victim services. However, I'll come on to the opportunities to address those in a second. And then as the statistics show, it appears that antisocial behaviour targeted towards underrepresented groups may not be being fully reported, and so perhaps we don't have that full picture. So there's something around engaging with the underrepresented groups as well. I touched on as well and the potential for underreporting in rural areas. Obviously, the figures show the concentrations in urban areas. So there's a question there around possible underreporting. And if that is the case, then just to understand the reasons why. And then lastly, the joint understanding with partners of the impact of the COVID regulations on antisocial behaviour, and identifying any learning from that that we need to take forward from that peak of 72% of all antisocial behaviour in February 21 being linked to breaches of the COVID regulations. The opportunities then. So the Early Action Together programme, known as EAT, is a whole range of transformational changes that have been brought in across the organisation, and part of that is the problem-solving training that I talked about earlier. We're moving into phase 2 of that, and that place-based working, where we're co-located with partners to have that really slick response to community concerns, is being rolled out as well in the coming months. So that will support our response to antisocial behaviour reports, and also the Pathways project, which is being rolled out to officers as we speak. And at the touch of a button, they've got a comprehensive list of all the services that are available to whoever it is that they're dealing with, including antisocial behaviour victims. And they'll be able to access that from the mobile devices, and it allows them to quickly check what services are available and to make a quick and easy referral if they need to make a referral by email, or to provide details to the individual of the support that's available for them. So I think that will address that first challenge. And then in terms of engagement with underrepresented groups, we've got our support networks, partner agencies do too, to help us build trust and confidence among those groups, inform them of their rights, and to engage with those people to give them reassurance that they can, around the ways of reporting to us, should they wish to do so, any antisocial behaviour that they're experiencing. The new ways of reporting, this is around maximising opportunities for individuals and communities to report antisocial behaviour to ourselves and to partners, particularly in areas where we think there could be underreporting. And I'd include a single online home in that as well, which hasn't actually officially gone live yet, but it's about to. And that is a system that enables online reporting of crimes and antisocial behaviour, or certain crime types. And then with partners to consider greater use of public space protection orders. They have been used in North Yorkshire already, and I'll come on to a case study in a minute of one of those. They're used to deal with a particular nuisance in a defined public space, where the nuisance behaviour is having a negative impact on the quality of life for those in that public space, and they can remain in place for up to 3 years. And they seem to be a good option for that seasonal antisocial behaviour, the nuisance that had been highlighted in the stats. And then lastly, the review with partners, with the community safety hubs around breaches of antisocial behaviour linked to breaches of the COVID regulations. So,
Ed, Tom has got a question for you.
Hi Ed, sorry.
Hi,
just on that previous slide, and actually relates to your challenges as well. Yeah. You talk a bit about engagement there with underrepresented groups. I want to ask a question about the engagement with victims or those affected by antisocial behaviour, and with communities to understand the impact and help them to understand what you've done and how well it has worked or not. How well do you think you are and your neighbourhood policing teams are engaging with communities and individuals around this? And I ask this just because, in terms of what we hear coming into the office, particularly through the complaints procedure, we know that there are underlying issues around people being regularly updated. And we know that in a number of locations, communities feel that they haven't really had any feedback about police successes, which give them that confidence. And as a result, actually what has happened is they've stopped reporting because they don't think anything is happening. And by a consequence, that means that obviously the police statistics come down, but actually there's not necessarily a true reflection of what is happening on the ground there. So how do you think you're doing on that engagement? Do you think there could be any improvement there? It's great to hear about those opportunities you're looking at with those underrepresented groups, but actually how are we communicating with everybody on these topics?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think that's something that place-based working will come into its own as we move towards that and genuinely embedding that across the organisation. That will mean that we're getting that genuine engagement, long-term problem solving in place with those communities that are perhaps feeling that they're not being given that service at the moment. I mean, obviously, it will be interesting to have sight of those reports that you mentioned, so that we can identify, are there any particular locations where we need to put a bit more effort in? So if you'd be happy to share that detail with me, I'd really appreciate that. And then equally, I think, but I say place-based working is something that will naturally address a lot of these issues that you've raised in terms of engagement with communities. So that's going to be, I say, something that's on the horizon, and we'll be we're adopting it as we speak at the moment. In terms of the engagement that the neighbourhood teams are doing, I mean, there's different approaches to that. Obviously, we're out on patrol frequently. There's the online space as well. I'd like to think that our communities know who their neighbourhood teams are and would feel happy to report to them. And then there's obviously a lot of work ongoing as well with the digital PCSOs who work in the online space. So not just around things like fraud, but also about encouraging people to report online. So I think, while it may feel like some communities aren't getting the service that they'd hoped for, there is an awful lot going on in terms of activity, and we are trying to think of innovative ways to engage with communities. Okay,
I'm more than happy. We have in general shared those instances with the local policing team so that those gaps can be picked up, and often, to people's credit, to very great success, and it's real encouragement to see that success. It's just obviously a shame that it wasn't necessarily done in the first place, but it's good to hear that. I'd be interested to just hear your reflections in terms of the place-based. So how do you see that being delivered effectively in those local communities? What are you expecting to happen through the place-based working?
Mm-hmm. It's not a one size. It's not a one size fits all. So place-based working is all about partners working together. So ourselves, the police, and other organisations, including fire, including public health, the community safety hubs, working together with a clear vision of getting to a point where communities are resourced and confident to be able to report problems to us, but also to be able to start to solve their own problems as well. So this is when we were touched on the deep democracy that was used at Skelton in York, and as Jenny referred to the resolution that had been put in there from the community fund. That is one example of where we've got people generally involved in a place, which was that particular area. A place can be defined in many different ways, and I think the trick is not to actually put a one size fits all on it and say all places look like this. There needs to be some flexibility with that, because what a place looks like will change depending on what the issue is that we're dealing with. There might be some that are potentially county-wide. There might be some that are at street level. There might be some that are at town level. So there'll be some flexibility with what a place looks like, and then therefore with which partners are involved. Co-location is something that has proved its worth, certainly at Scarborough, in the community safety hub there, where all the partners are located and together. It enables this very early joint understanding of an issue and a very rapid response to it as well. So that's a model that we can certainly follow for place-based working elsewhere. And then also in Craven, there's been some really good work done there as well in terms of developing those links, and it's proving really, really effective in a rural situation in Craven in terms of that joint working there as well. So just a couple of examples of what it can look like, but it's very much tailored to the issue and tailored to the locality as well, and making sure that all the right people around the table with the right powers and having those conversations and reaching joint solutions involving communities as well, and really listening to what people want and what their expectations are.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I come in on that, Ed? Because I've been to the Scarborough Community Hub, and it is fantastic and it works exceptionally well. So I'd like to compliment you on that. It really is very good. I've just got a question about how do the police and our partners build trust within communities that have been affected by antisocial behaviour?
I think it's by dealing with it. To take it, quite frankly, I think that's that's really the best way to build confidence with communities is by by making sure that we're being effective in delivering those long-term sustainable solutions for them. So it's not a case of, we're getting into cycles of repeat calling where somebody's been blighted by nuisance on a regular basis, and we're going and dealing with it and coming away, and then the same thing's happening night after night after night. I think the way that we build confidence is by implementing those long-term sustainable solutions, which we can only do with partners, with appropriate interventions, with the perpetrators as well, diversionary schemes, etc., and quite an innovative, easy for me to say, innovative approach as well to dealing with ASB. I think that's the way that we build confidence, by using all the tools available to us. And I wouldn't leave, as I say, I wouldn't leave enforcement out of that as well. I think there is a very proper place for enforcement using the legislation as well within that to build trust and confidence.
Thank you. Just out of interest, are you going to be talking about the community trigger in any of your slides?
I haven't got a slide on it, Commissioner, but I can cover that off at the end if you wish.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Okay. So last couple of slides from myself. So cops versus kids, this leads really nicely on from what we were just talking about then, actually. This is a case study of an initiative that we ran last summer in York, and it was around engaging with young people who were particularly vulnerable to going down, into criminality, antisocial behaviour, that kind of thing, and who actually didn't particularly want to talk to the police, believe it or not. They were also frequently going missing, etc., and there were some real concerns for their safety and well-being as well in terms of exploitation. So it was like, how do we reach out to these people? So it was a case of finding a way that we could engage with them on their terms, and we developed this initiative, or Chris Simpson, one of our PCSOs at York, one of the digital PCSOs, developed this initiative in collaboration with the National Esports Society. And it was a case of this being a gateway to get to engage with young people in terms of, then fostering early intervention and prevention, reducing victim harm, community harm, and improving our knowledge and capacity and capability to tackle vulnerability. So in a neutral venue, we had computers basically set up, and participants were identified through youth justice schools, through the school liaisons office team as well, and the cybercrime team as well, to identify young people who didn't meet the thresholds for national interventions. And some of them had recently been involved in knife crime, violence, antisocial behaviour, and very much on the fringes of criminal behaviour as well. So it was a case of getting in early before these behaviours escalated, in a relaxed and friendly environment, playing computer games with the kids played against the officers, the neighbourhood policing teams. I've got to be honest, the kids tended to win most of the games, but it really this created a very relaxed and friendly environment so that conversations could progress organically, and we could then introduce concepts with them around personal safety and doing the right thing, acceptable behaviour, etc. So this initiative has been evaluated, and we have seen as a result greater levels of engagement with these young people, reductions in missing reports, reductions in antisocial behaviour reports involving those perpetrators as well. And so it's going to be, now the plan is to roll it out across the county. We've purchased additional equipment so that can be done, and it has actually generated national interest from Prevent, National Crime Agency, and also it was discussed at the UN Security Council as a way of engaging with children and young people in a really effective way. So this is something that we're keen to progress, as I say, almost like a diversionary scheme away from inappropriate behaviour. Opportunities, I've touched on this already, so I won't go into too much detail around this one. But single online home, in terms of new ways of reporting, this is a quick and intuitive way, so it improves accessibility for all our communities in terms of reporting antisocial behaviour and other and crime to us as well. So the figures show that even though single online home hasn't been officially launched yet, we are receiving antisocial behaviour reports through the system. For example, in the week that ended in the 27th of March, we received 16 antisocial behaviour reports through single online home, which was about 10% of antisocial behaviour reports that week. So I anticipate that when it's actually launched fully, we'll see those numbers increase even more, and that will be, as I say, another way to engage with in terms of reporting with perhaps communities who aren't reporting to us as much as we'd wish. It just increases the range of opportunities for them. Another quick case study here. This is around the public service protection orders. I'll just go through this one, summarise, and then I'll come on to the community trigger at the very end, if that's okay. So Richmond, most people will know, is a vibrant market town in North Yorkshire. In 2020, there was growing reports of antisocial behaviour around the waterfalls area, which led to the district council there and partners, including the police, taking action to protect this area. There was consultation was done with the local community there. There was very much widespread support for this approach, and a multi-agency task group was formed, including councillors, officers from Richmondshire District Council, the police, the county council, etc., with the aim of looking at short-term and longer-term solutions. And one of the longer-term solutions was the Public Spaces Protection Order, which was introduced. It was approved by the board in January 21 and came into effect in April for 3 years. And it prevents all kind of inappropriate behaviour, including congregating in a group that's likely to cause harassment, obstruction or concern for safety, threatening abusive behaviour, continuing to consume alcohol when required to stop, being under the influence of controlled drugs, throwing objects which are likely to cause damage, lighting or being in control of a fire or a barbecue, and littering as well. And it's proved to be really, really effective in reducing antisocial behaviour in the waterfalls area of Richmond, and there's been a huge amount of community support for that. So in terms of when we were talking earlier around how do we build trust and confidence in our communities, this is one way to do it, using public spaces protection orders with partners when it's appropriate to do so. The lessons that came out of this from the evaluation: effective community engagement and consultation is essential to ensure that we've got enough evidence to justify the restrictions being imposed, and that the action won't have a detrimental effect on vulnerable people. And then positive engagement and support from the police is key. The police role is essential in gathering the required evidence for fixed penalty notices. And also, as this is a specific beauty spot in Richmond, it's not anticipated that the problem behaviour will be displaced to other locations close by. But that was, I say, the learning from that one, and it's something. Okay, that's just one example of a PSPO. So aims and results. In the next 12 months and beyond, this is what we're planning to do, to deliver and evaluate the next round of problem solving training. So supporting that joint approach with partners to antisocial behaviour, resulting in those long-term sustainable solutions. Enforcement, which I've touched on quite a lot, a continued joint approach with partners and using the most appropriate powers to resolve whatever the issue is, fitting in again with place-based working and tailoring the approach so that it gives the best possible service to our communities. Innovation, initiatives such as Cops versus Kids, and then the Pathways project as well to signpost support for victims so that we're making sure that they're in touch with the support services that are available to them. And then that review of the COVID response to COVID regulations as well, so that we can understand that with future joint monitoring of antisocial behaviour through the community safety hubs. And then enhancing engagement with underrepresented groups and hard to reach communities, including young people, leading to confidence to report antisocial behaviour and also to better outcomes as well. That was the end of my slides, so I'll stop sharing at that point and I'll just move on to community trigger quickly. So I've looked at the figures for community trigger in terms of a mechanism. Obviously it came in under the 2014 legislation as an option to deal with antisocial behaviour, particularly in that's affecting communities. So from the second half of last year, July to December 2021, there were actually 2 community triggers that were used within our area, both in Harrogate. There was also several PSPOs, public safety protection orders, and some community prevention notices as well. The community trigger, sits with the community safety hubs, with the local authorities, and 3 reports of antisocial behaviour are necessary to raise a trigger. And then one of the problems with it is that only 3 can then be assessed. So it can sometimes miss out the bigger picture. But generally what happens is when there's a number of reports of antisocial behaviour, these are picked up by the community safety hubs and working with safe neighbourhood teams to address those. And what we've found from experience is that when a community trigger has been invoked and the review has been done of the action that's been taken to date, it's been found that everything that's been possible has been done, which is reassuring. So I think community trigger is something which is potentially a little bit underutilised when you look at the numbers. Potentially the reason for that is that in terms of publicity of it, there's perhaps a piece of work that we can do around publicising it so that people have got better knowledge and know that they have got the right to have these reviews done. But I also just wanted to give some reassurance that even when community trigger hasn't been actioned or hasn't been used, there's still an awful lot of support that's being given to repeat victims of antisocial behaviour, and that's just in recognition of the vulnerability there. So what would happen, a repeat victim of antisocial behaviour would be picked up through the North Yorkshire Police's internal intelligence systems, and that will be brought up at the local district intelligence meeting. That will be then allocated to one of the neighbourhood policing teams for them to do a review and ensure that everything that's been done is being done to support the repeat victims. And that would include, more often than not, linking in with local partners, including the local community impact team through their tasking mechanism. Plan owners are provided internally with antisocial behaviour problem profiles, so the command teams have got antisocial behaviour problem profiles which highlight hotspots and repeat victims and repeat offenders as well. And there's a real expectation that the teams view those profiles and identify what action needs to be taken to address those problems. So there's an awful lot going on to support repeat victims of antisocial behaviour already, but I think community triggers is perhaps something that we could look at to publicise a bit more through the community safety hubs, just to make sure that people have got that knowledge that this is an option for them and that it exists as a mechanism should they wish the action to be reviewed. Tom, did you want to come in?
Thanks, Ed. Just to clarify some assurance around what you've just talked about there. So repeat sounds very promising in terms of the process that you've outlined there around repeat victims. How often would somebody have to be reporting antisocial behaviour for them to be flagged on that process, first of all? To
be picked up locally, it would be more than once.
Just more than once, so yeah. 2 times, and they'd be referred to the community safety hub.
It would be, they wouldn't necessarily be referred to the community safety hub, but it would be picked up by the local MPT, neighbourhood policing team, who would then make an assessment and decide what action they needed to take.
Okay, and in terms of confidence levels around that happening every single time there is an individual there, how confident are you that, and do we have data in the background to assure us that that is happening every single time somebody is flagging up as a repeat victim?
Yeah, accountability goes through the force tasking meeting. So this is the problem profiles that I was talking about earlier that are shared with the local command teams for each district. So repeat victims will be flagged on those, and then the command teams would then assure themselves that appropriate action had been taken.
Okay, so there is an assurance mechanism in place to double check those things.
Indeed, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, I think that's the end of the questions. Thank you very much, Ed. That was very interesting and informative. Thank you. Thanks for that report. So we'll go on to agenda item 5, which is North Yorkshire Police performance update. And Elliot Foskett, you are going to be taking this one, please.
Thank you very much. Just bear with me. I will try to get the technology to work, which is difficult for a Luddite. So bear with me a second. I am hoping you can all see that. Yep, great.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Commissioner. Thank you. So the North Yorkshire Police performance presentation starts with This slide in relation to contacting the police and our 999 performance. So we continue to see an above average emergency call volume, and that's reflective actually of the national picture. Demand into the control room continues to be high, not just for North Yorkshire, but across the country. And I guess just for a bit of context, Commissioner, in 2015, 999 calls started the year in January at just over 19,000. And that's a similar levels for 16 and 17. But by this year, nationally, this was 28,600. And in the last 3 months, there's been over 2,000 additional 999 calls to North Yorkshire Police. So just to give that bit of context, really, as to what we're working with. And I guess the point is demand is going to go up through the summer. We know that this happens all the time. And again, nationally, there's a working group been set up to try and tackle some of this 999 demand with a bit of education for the public. So I know that you will be aware there's a huge amount of work going on within the force control room at the moment, and with partners across North Yorkshire to help manage that demand appropriately as well. And I know it's been a subject of other meetings, but I just wanted to update on that point. You'll see from the figures there's been nearly a 19% increase in calls in March compared to February. And this is an upward trend, as I said, and you can see it's likely to continue. And it's a 32% increase in calls compared to March 2021. And our speed of answering, as you see, is slower than it has been for March. The good news, I guess, is that the speed of answering for the calls is coming down, and I'm sure that will be the subject of next month's in relation to that. I can't see if there are any questions, so please do just shout up if there are any. So slide 3101, again, in relation to our public calls, as we call them, the calls into the non-emergency calls into the control room. And what you can see here, conversely, really, is a reduction in demand for 101. And that's, we believe, due to channel shift as well, people using single online home and other means to contact the police as well. And there's been that decrease since February, but an increase in the speed of answering. And again, that's due to so the operatives within the force control room generally taking more time because they've got 999 calls to answer. We'd expect to see this continue to rise as well. But again, as I've said previously, huge amount of work ongoing at the moment within that force control room. And I'm really optimistic you'll start to see a change in that very, very soon. So on to our policing response then. And as you can see from the slide, our emergency, we call them immediates, but our emergency graded response time sits slightly higher than the 2-year average. You'd expect it to be higher than a 2-year average given the low deployments and low levels of crime, etc. under COVID, but it is slightly higher, and the volume of those immediate grade incidents is increasing. And again, with that influx of 999 calls, this is expected. We would see that correlate to that as well. So the response times, as you can see, 12 minutes and 49 seconds in rural locations, 7 minutes 59 seconds in urban areas. That's from the time the officer is dispatched to arriving at the incident. That lead time that it talks about there is that time that the call lands in the control room, and then officers and staff within that control room processing that, making sure they're getting the right resources to it as well. But again, that increase in demand into the control room is going to lead to that in any case. The volume has a slight downward trend actually in priority graded response. It's ever so slight from the graph. It's hard to make it out, but there is certainly over the past 4 weeks. There's been a reduction, as you can see there. I know it's been discussed at previous meetings, but I think worth pointing out at the bottom of the slide there, you will see the amount of officers and time that we put into public safety and welfare, for example. So the total of 3,119 there for I grades, 3,244 for public safety and welfare. They can be really resource intensive, and it's absolutely right to deal with probably the most vulnerable situations we are in the most effective way. And then conversely, the crime, which is lower for the amount of officers we send, but we'll take more time dealing with crime because obviously generally we're dealing with more victims, witnesses, scenes, etc. as well. So that would be the reason for that. Crime volumes then. Well, as you can see, and I know you're aware, this slide shows the crime data against the date that the crime was committed. And the slide shows, actually good news really, the slide shows a decrease in crime, down 9.36% over the 4 weeks, so that is good news. Possession of weapons, possession of offensive weapons and robbery show the biggest increases here. And as you can see, if you look at the bottom of that slide, you'll see the graph there. Although they have gone up, what you will see is that it's within normal kind of fluctuations. We'd expect to see that. But I did do a bit of digging, as you'd expect me to do, in relation to what that's about. And in relation to possession of weapons, usually any spikes that you will see in that are related to targeted operations. Now, whether that's against drugs enforcement, like county lines, for example, those are generally responsible for those rises in seizures of those who habitually carry weapons, really. There are several within there, or there are some in there that I will say relate to other agencies more recently, and I can't go into those for obvious reasons, but again, they are responsible for some of those. But actually, whilst that increases, it is good news. That means those weapons are off the streets. They're not being carried. We are removing them and we're bringing people to justice around it. So very good news in relation to that. In relation to robbery, it is a slight upward trend over the last 12 months. And I guess from me, I guess the caveat to that is they are still relatively low numbers. When you look at them, if you look to the left-hand side there, you'll see that the numbers we're talking about are low. But it is something that we are picking up. And it's not one thing or another. It's not personal robbery versus commercial robbery. It's an increase in both slightly. So as the lead for crime specialist ops, it's something I've asked for further analysis on, and it will be monitored through our performance monitoring framework for the force. And where we do spot those trends, obviously we'll be deploying resources accordingly through our tasking process. So I will dig into that a little bit more, and it might be worthwhile just bringing that back next month just to say what it is we found, if that's in order with you, Commissioner.
Elliot, can I just jump in here quickly?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Shoplifting. It hasn't had a huge spike necessarily, but there's fair volume there. I don't know whether you've got some longer term trends on that. I can't. It doesn't obviously get broken down in the on the next slide to see there, but it'd just be interesting to see some longer term trends or get your thoughts on that in relation to the kind of current economic situation.
Yeah, of course, Tom. No, I mean, looking at it, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's really hard to know if that's just again, not huge numbers, really, considering the size of the county, really. But I will look into it for you. We can bring it back next time, just to have a bit of a breakdown of what that was. And again, it gives us that opportunity, I guess, to get ahead of the game and work with our business sector and partners to make sure that they are doing what they need to do, and we're working with them to keep that down, really. But yeah, happy to bring that back.
Thanks.
Okay, crime volume. So it's just going on really from the previous slide. It does show, I know you've seen these before, that rolling 12-month data, the 90-day data, and then the 31-day data there. And you can see the thing that for me that stood out was theft, as Tom's just actually highlighted, which of course incorporates shoplifting. But I did a little bit more digging into that, just to find out what lay behind it. So shoplifting is in there, and there's a category called other theft, which again, when we broke that down, some of those in there were in relation to what used to be an old-fashioned offence called bilking, or making off without payment, and they generally relate to filling stations, people doing what's colloquially known as drive-offs, and there's been an increase in those over the past month, and that is, again, small numbers, 9 up to 49. So and the bulk of those held in the larger sort of conurbations and where you'd expect, really. The reason I'm highlighting it is, I guess, with the rise in fuel prices, it may be expected. So again, this is something that under my portfolio I've asked for a little bit more clarity on, and we'll track that and make sure it's not something that is going to be a problem for the people of and businesses of North Yorkshire, and try and get ahead of the game a little bit, really, where we can. So I just thought it's worth mentioning at this meeting. In relation to other crime within that, some good news in relation to violence against the person, which is down slightly, but it is down, which is really good news as well. So dealing with crime then, over the past 24 months, the difference there you can see, actually, if you look over the 24-month period, it's up 9.86%, but actually over the past 12 months, it is down. There's a downward trend in crime. And as I said, I'm not going to go into the dotted lines of your lockdowns, and I know that's been discussed at other accountability meetings too. The differential between the bottom and the top, I've asked for. There's nothing remarkable in that. And I did dig into that slide and find out they do sort of visually correlate, but because they're so sort of wide apart, it's really hard to see any difference. So it's something that I'll talk to our performance team about going forward, just to make sure that that's a little bit more meaningful for us in this performance meeting. But was there any questions around that one before I move on? Thank you. So this one then, I think is just worth lingering on a little bit. Again, if you look at that violence against the person, that's the one I was talking about. You would expect to see, as we've said, that degree of increase following restrictions that were in place, and as you can see, that steady climb then. But actually, once it hit that peak in July last year, we have seen that downward trend. And for me, this is now all about stabilising that downward trend and trying to not let that peak go up again during the busy summer months, which we know it's prone to do, but there are things that we can do about that. Further down into the middle one, the sexual offences one, that 34% increase, and you can see the two spikes there, the two humps really within that graph. And the bit for me around that was I wanted to see, looking at those months, whether or not there was any correlation between that and the holiday periods, i.e. the influx of people within North Yorkshire as a county, tourists, for example. What I will say is that early indications are that there is some correlation with that. So I've tasked out some additional work to be done to look at the prevention around that. Working with head of crime, but also working with our communications team to make sure that the messaging is going out and that we're taking preventative steps. But overall, we've got a stable picture in relation to that. And then further down, acquisitive crime, some brilliant work being done in relation to fraud and safeguarding of fraud now. So I'm really pleased with that. That remains low. And I linked in with the national fraud and cyber team earlier on this week, actually, who were actually pretty glowing about the response from North Yorkshire in relation to cyber as well. So really good news. Crime investigation outcomes. Just not to regurgitate all the figures, because I know that you can read them, but I think the resolution rate is one to just look at, and that 37% is fairly stable, and that 37% of resolved relating to a charge. Victim reasons, 28% where victim declines to support, and that 82% have a named suspect. And I know this has been discussed before as well, but it's really worth lingering on. Where there is evidence and a need to safeguard, just because a victim doesn't support a prosecution, that does not prevent the police from bringing an evidence-led prosecution, which we do. And those tend to be in cases of violence, and in particular domestic violence, where we have a duty of care and a duty to try and protect the victim. So I thought that's worth mentioning that again. The closed pending, those are the ones, 25%, those where there are no other lines of inquiry and no suspect identified. And I think the bottom chart, I asked to a little bit of work around that as well. We've got 17% awaiting outcome, and again, I know it's been discussed in the past. There's a lot of focus on this within North Yorkshire Police at the moment, and there's some governance around it to ensure that by June, any that are currently awaiting outcome, we do get those finalised, because it does hide that really good work and the hard work that many of our investigators and our officers and our staff are doing. If we don't finalise those, we don't get that kind of credit for the real positive action that we're taking. One of the things I did dig into was, as you would, I think, looking back towards the left-hand side of the chart and seeing 236 there from April 2019 that are still awaiting outcome. So I've asked the question about that, and a lot of those crimes there, and I'll illustrate it. The 236, for example, 211 of those actually relate to what we call non-crimes. So they've simply been put on the system initially as a crime, for example, and then taken off as a crime. So they sit there, and I've got my the team, the business insights team, are going to start looking at that and making sure they're correctly classified. So this is a lot more accurate and gives you that better reflection going forward.
Elliot, just on that, thank you. That sounds really positive. We did have some questions outstanding around this that I don't think Mark was ever able to send across in the end, and maybe what you're talking about there is kind of the result of that. But there was particularly, I mean, seems to be an awful lot of fraud crimes that are held. I don't know whether they fall into that category of non-crimes that you're talking about, but fraud crimes that are held by the National Fraud Investigation Bureau, which are, for one reason or other, held open on our system, and kind of seemingly skew some of that, but also hide what is potentially underneath that. And then there are a number of what seemed like quite high-profile assaults that were still open from a number of years back, which we just wanted to test around. So I'll if I can, I'll forward an email to you outside of the meeting and just ask for some assurance around those.
Of course, no. So certainly, Tom, the frauds shouldn't be non-crimes, because it'll either be a crime in our system because it's committed here, or it's been committed somewhere else and it will have been transferred off on our forced crime and incident registrar. Probably one of the best I've seen, actually, at North Yorkshire, really on it. So they will be on that. So I will look into it. It may be that they're being held and continue to be investigated because some of those are so complex, crossing international boundaries, etc., that we just haven't got an outcome update for, or it may be that we just simply need to chase them and make sure that it's all married up. So yeah, please send that across. I'll have a look at it. And again, around the assaults, some of them tend to be things like, and I won't go into details, but some of them can involve extradition and international inquiries, which mean that they do get held on the system for a long time. But yeah, I'll look into that for you.
Thank you.
So the victim's journey, as you'll be aware, this is a bit of a focus for us at the moment. So we've got a new sergeant's post within the Criminal Justice Department at the moment, conducting dip sampling, and that work has already commenced. And they're looking at things like the victim's contract, keeping victims updated on the outcome, on a charge, etc., and then victim personal statements, all of that, the whole victim's journey. And that's being dip sampled currently, and we'll have a much clearer picture in about 4 to 8 weeks of how that looks and how compliant we are with that as a force. So that new post also then gives us the opportunity to educate officers and staff as well, and 10 briefings, which I think is really valuable. So alongside this, there's some scrutiny, as I think you know, in place in relation to what we would call a supervisory footprint, so oversight of crime, so at all levels. Now, that is currently ongoing as well. And I know it's been something that's been looked at by our business insights team, and early indication from the dip sampling seems to suggest that this is really positive. But again, once we've got a much better data set, we'll be able to bring that back and show you just what our position is. But I'm optimistic that's looking good at the moment. Section 136, and worth explaining, Section 136 is of the Mental Health Act. This is for people who are in immediate need of care and control out in the community, and officers either come across them or deployed to them. Those people that are really suffering from some kind of mental health issue, some episode, etc., and generally distressed. As you can see, I think this illustrates that slide earlier on. We talked about public safety and welfare. The average officers per occurrence 4.34, so it's quite a lot of officers generally deployed to that. And then to the right there, that equates to roughly 12 hours per occurrence. So it's a lot of volume, and it's a lot of officer and staff time taken up with it, but they are quite often some of the most vulnerable people out in our community, and that's why it's important to take the right amount of time with it. So it is higher in volume than previously seen, and as you can see, one detainee taken out of county. I think the thing that's worth looking at is the 13 incidents requiring police transportation. It's not ideal for us to do that, but occasionally that is the best way for us to do it. And then 28% or 9, I think that works out to have detentions resulting in admission, with the rest returned to community. And it's something we're really keen on ensuring that we're taking people to that health-based place of safety rather than custody, and rather than a cell. However, if you look down the bottom, the graph at the bottom will show you, certainly from about October, November, December time, you'll see that sudden rise again in the amount of people taking to that health-based place of safety. And then that bottom line shows you how many people were in custody for another offence, and their condition, their mental health has deteriorated whilst in custody, and have then been taken on. So I think the thing that illustrates to me, or this whole slide illustrates to me, is the complexity of policing. That one minute we're talking about theft and shoplifting and assaults, and then the next minute you're talking about the huge amount of resource you have to put into this side as well.
Can I ask a question on that, please, Elliot?
Certainly.
So it's interesting to see these numbers, and also to understand why our policing resources are tied up. And would you say that when people in crisis are taken to 136 suites, that there seems to be a bit of a sticking block there, as in the police resources are tied up for quite a long time, and I just wondered why that was. Could you give me some kind of outlook on that?
I can give you my best guess on it, but you probably want more detail than that. So I mean, from experience, this is generally when you take someone to a place of safety and you're waiting for that mental health assessment to take place, and it may be that the healthcare professionals tied up somewhere else and can't get there straight away. So it does take that time. It can be a kind of a resource intensive thing for us when you've got people sitting with people who are suffering from mental health, because actually we're not trained as mental health professionals, but we do have that positive obligation to keep people safe. So if we were to just walk away from them there and then, and they move out into the community again, actually I don't think we're fulfilling our duty. I think again it's probably worth having a look at that in detail for you and just saying, how often does that happen? When we're talking about that amount of time and that 12 hours, how much of that is spent with the person at the place of safety, and how much is spent prior to that? And I'll try and get that breakdown for you if that's something we can do.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Elliot. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I all right for time? Do you need to move me along a bit? I'll go a bit quicker.
Well, you've probably got another 5 minutes, Max.
Okay, I will rattle through then. Sorry. Stop and search. So 1,905 people searches have been conducted with an overall positive outcome, i.e. something found on them, of 18%. And of this, there was also an outcome rate of 9.13% for what we call positive other. So you've searched for one item, but you found something else. So that's just worth noting as well. So but 72.7% of the searches led to no further action, which sounds it sounds like actually that's quite high, but actually the national average is higher than that. It's about 78% for the previous year. So North Yorkshire doing reasonably well in the stop search front. But of course, there is a big difference in disproportionality, and this slide I think sets out really well the searches of residents in the county versus non-residents. And there are two bits to draw from this for me. The non-residents, I suspect, more likely to be travelling into the county and intelligence led, and therefore that's why you see those higher rates of outcomes as well. But the bit that I'll take away from this, and I'm working with I forget, I think it's Fee Willie who's doing this, and I've probably got the name wrong. Still quite new. It is. Thanks, Ed. I'm working with Fee on this to look at the stop searches, to look at disproportionality, and to make sure that we understand the reasons for it. Because I think it's really good to see that actually when we're doing those targeted ones, we are targeting more. We are searching more actually Asian, Black, and other minority ethnic members of a community, but the positive outcome rate goes up proportionately for those out of county that are travelling in. But conversely, you will see from the top of the slide to the bottom, our Black population locally, we're searching and getting a positive outcome of 20%, but then when those people are travelling into the county, it's 8% lower. So there's something going on there that we will start to dig into with this use of powers meeting that I'm looking to introduce. So that disproportionality is very much on our radar, and it will be something that I'll be looking to work with the communities on as we go through this and start to explore it further. The workforce slide, again, I think you can see what the figures are, but again, of note from that next target, the target for next year for police officers, 1,648. So we've got that police uplift programme, a bit more scrutiny on that than perhaps we had in the past, just to make sure that we are going to meet that really important target to ensure that we get the right amount of officers out on the streets and into the jobs that they need to be to keep the people of North Yorkshire safe. Pcso numbers have dropped by 2 this month. Pcso recruitment is underway. It's stalled slightly, but again, that's being regrouped, and we're just looking at that succession planning and how we recruit a little bit more wider than we currently are to help fill those numbers. Police staff, special volunteers, you can see our police staff increased by 9.3. I don't know the reason for the volunteers decreasing by 10, but I will look at that. I'm just not sure why that is. So you know, it's worth asking that question, because we do rely heavily on specials and volunteers and people working with us. So I'll look at that one. Workforce diversity. You know, I think we all know we're not where we want to be with that, but there's a good bit of scrutiny on this now, some governance. The Deputy Chief Constable chairs the gold group. I am now the silver for that. So there's again, I expect to see a little bit of change around that and a greater focus on that as well going forward. And then I think this is my final slide. You'll be pleased to know the COVID-19 sickness absence. No surprises, we're pretty stable between 40 and 55. What you will see from the top right is that gradual now self-isolation tailing off as we've had those restrictions lifted. And then you can see from the bottom our other sickness rates. Coronavirus still showing as the highest, but of course that's likely to tail off significantly over the next year. Fingers crossed and touching wood all over the place here. And that concludes my performance presentation, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elliot. That was very in-depth. Thank you for that. And also thank you for the further questions and pieces of work you've asked for. That's great. Thank you very much. Right, moving on to agenda item 6, and that's North Yorkshire Fire Service, fire investigation presentation with Dave Winspear and Pete Gregory.
Okay, if I can just get it launched. Could somebody please just say when it's
I now do.
It's
come through? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon in answering the questions you've posed to the Chief Fire Officer about the subject of fire investigation. I'm joined this afternoon by a colleague, Pete Gregory, who is one of our senior fire investigation officers, and he's the current lead for the fire investigation team. So throughout the course of this presentation, we're going to explain why we investigate fires, who investigates fires, what we do when we investigate fires, and we're also going to look at some of the things that we learn from those investigations, and that will hopefully cover the question that was made by Julie, the member of the public, earlier on at the start of the PAM. We will touch on some of the background legislation where we get our powers to investigate from, and that will take us on to some of the more recent developments that will be going on within the fire investigation world around some changes to codes of practice and requirements placed upon fire services in this area of our work. So really, the opening question I'd like to look at is, why do we investigate fires? And there is a list put out here for me just to go through, and I'll expand on some of these points in a bit more detail. We are required to determine as best we can the cause for every fire that we attend. We, across the country, all fire and rescue services fill in what's called an IRS, an incident recording system. And that really allows for a national picture on the cause of fires to be created through the Office of National Statistics, so we can look at where we start to see patterns, trends occurring. One of the things that information has been able to provide is the national downward trend in fires, and we can also therefore look at the breakdown of fires in terms of accidental, deliberate, or those fires where, to be fair, it's simply impossible to determine whether it is accidental or deliberate, and we're in that territory. We just don't know. Some of our investigations are there to test compliance with the law. Everybody will be familiar with the very high-profile Grenfell Tower fire and the investigations that led from that, which led us to understand the breakdown and failure in some of the cladding and the internal compartmentation systems within inside that building. And it's the fire investigation teams obviously lead that investigation along with other organisations and colleagues from them. But we are really looking to see whether there's been any breach in legislation in that particular case that would look at things to do with building regulations, or also in terms of the materials that have been used. We may be asked to investigate fires as part of public inquiries, where we can basically use our expertise, our knowledge, our depth of experience in this area of work to support and provide information to such an inquiry. And we may contribute to investigations that ultimately lead to try and determine liability for that. The Fire and Rescue Services, certainly North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, do not undertake private investigation work that supports and feeds into private cases, but we will be involved at the early stage of investigations to understand where the fire started, and Pete will explain more about that a little bit later on. But some of that investigative work does then feed into longer term processes whereby insurance companies will get involved, and we have a very close relationship, which is beneficial to us, with some of the main forensic fire investigators. And I say a very close, but a very good reciprocal arrangement, because they have an ability to take the investigation much further than we can. And quite often they will share back with us their findings, which really helps us to enrich our understanding for future work. When we come to some of our most serious fires, certainly those fires that lead or involve fatalities or serious injuries, we carry out what's called a serious fire review. And that review is not just something that is for fire and rescue staff. We invite colleagues from other organisations, such as the police, to come and take part in that review. And that really is for us to understand a lot of the factors or things around the investigation, things that happened prior to the fire, things that happened during the fire. We look at our response, so how do we mobilise resources, what did we do, how did we use equipment. Basically, it's an exercise in trying to identify points for learning and improvement. Some of the actions that come out of that, however, also feed into other pieces of work. So we have unfortunately had some fatal fires, which have led us to then work actually with colleagues from North Yorkshire Police and their safeguarding teams to request what's called a safeguarding adult review, or we might have a single service review undertaken as well, which basically does a deep dive into what's been done by a more independent body, and those findings are then fed back to us, which we could then use for future work. And interestingly, just this morning, I had a very useful meeting with one of the health authorities looking at frailty. So last month I spoke about the community risk profile and where we had identified a number of the factors that we felt were very significant to understanding what put people at risk of accidental dwelling fires. And much of that information has come from things like the fatal fire review and the serious fire reviews that we undertake. That's where the learning comes from. And so we can use that learning and push it into our prevention and protection activities. So we can very much direct our staff to do campaigns, pieces of work. You'll see on this particular slide, there are a few graphics. Unfortunately, we've had a number of fires where people are very frail, in effect bedridden, and people often then use what are called emollient creams, or they might use airflow mattresses, both of which can actually increase the rapidity of a fire developing and spreading, or actually make things like bedding and clothing more ignitable. So we've done a lot of work in trying to raise awareness of that. Going back to the question raised by Julie, again, we had a spate where we started to see a number of fires in basically tumble dryers or piles of laundered washing in restaurants and hotels. It was actually down to the impregnation of oils and fats and greases that weren't being properly cleaned out, and then that was getting put into tumble dryers and then folded. So we did a big piece of work to provide advice out to the hotel and leisure industries to make them aware. And that's the sort of thing that then when we do our fire safety work, we're providing that information out to businesses so they understand a problem before it actually hits them with a problem. And where we see problems with things like white goods, so fridges, freezers, dishwashers, tumble dryers, etc. Again, we have a facility where we can ask people through our website to register appliances. This is in effect where things like your product recall come from. So when I go back to the first stat about information about records and information, if we are now starting to inform nationally that there's a particular make and model of an appliance that's starting to catch fire, that will get captured, and that's where the manufacturer then notified and it triggers the product recall. So who investigates? Well, obviously,
sorry, Dave, sorry, can I just a couple of questions on the last slide, just to follow on from what you were talking about there. In terms of your prevention and protection work then, so you mentioned kind of serious fire reviews and some of those other trends. Does that, and you've talked about pushing some of that material back out. So can we take from that that in terms of the tasking of whole-time firefighter crews, in terms of their prevention and protection work, in terms of the community safety officers, when one of these trends is identified, that learning is taken into the service, and then actually their tasking for jobs is oriented around some of that learning? Is that the way that process would work? What's the process behind what you've just described, please?
So basically people in the prevention team or protection team will be kind of monitoring on a daily basis and reviewing what's happening. And we don't just look within North Yorkshire. The point I would like to make here is that we have a much wider lens. So we are very much aware of what's going on regionally and indeed nationally. So when we start to see things that are of real note and interest. When I was talking about prevention in some previous PAMs, we've introduced something called, well, we work towards something called a person-centred approach. So, for example, when we're doing a safe and well visit, which is where we visit a person or a family within the home, domestic setting, we're looking at three things. We're looking at the building, we're looking at who the person is, but we're also looking at the behaviours. And when we start to see things like the use of emollients and as a case in point, that's where, if it becomes apparent where we're working with a member of the family who use them, we can start to use our learning, our information, our resources, and our staff have got access to that because we've really developed a nice suite of information tools that they can draw from. So the prevention protection teams are responsible for identifying, picking up the issue, putting the tools in place, and that's pushed out to staff to use as part of their core work. And as we talked about last month when we did about the risk profile, we've got a real focus now on a particular set of factors. And I've just mentioned frailty, but age was taught before as one of them. So we're trying to target our activities now much more to those people who have those factors. and we're also like bringing in a new mechanism. So the online referral form that we want to have now will filter out, and then we'll be able to like put our resources into the right places in a very timely way to really sort of try and target prevention as effectively as we can. So
right.
Hopefully that answers your question, Tom.
Yeah, that it does. Thank you. And just another one to follow up this as well. In terms of what you were talking about there around trends and types of mattress or those kinds of things. If we see these trends coming through, whether it's around white appliances or so on, are there any changes that the service makes to firefighting tactics in terms of what we learn from as a result of these investigations in terms of the way fire spreads?
Yes, a very good question, actually. Yeah, fire investigation. When I talked about the review of it, obviously, the next slide or the next sorts of slides, we'll talk about what we expect to get from it. But when Pete speaks, he'll talk about three things. We're looking for where the fire started, how the fire started, how it spread and moved. So, if I give an example of heritage buildings. So in North Yorkshire, we've got a lot of properties that actually fall within that category of being old heritage. Not all are listed, but they have inherent problems within them in terms of they've got ducts and voids and gaps and things. Compartmentation is not as good as it would in modern standards. So the understanding from our experience of fighting fires in those buildings and the subsequent investigations then feeds into our training programs, our incident command programs, and actually it's that understanding of behaviour. So we did a very significant piece of work over the last couple of years, really as a result of the learning from Grenfell about what's called buildings that fail in fire. So things like timber construction or high-rise buildings, or buildings that have got factors that have led them to sort of have problems. We've used that to impart with our incident command, so they now know what to look for, what considerations to have in what we call their dynamic and analytical risk assessment of managing the incident. And then also it goes further to look at, if we can really sort of focus on firefighter safety, again, what kind of buildings do we want to have really good risk information on for our firefighters to have? So it may be that we go and say, right, you really need now to get more information on this type of building because we've identified an issue in it and we want you to have really good access to that if you need it when you go to a serious fire. So it is a very joined up process, and I think fire investigation, it really does pave the way to sort of then push out lots of information to lots of departments within the organisation to then focus on light response, training, incident command, etc.
Thank you.
So who investigates? Well, obviously we do. You will probably pick up through the course of the presentation that we'll be making reference to lots of other organisations, and I'll start very much with North Yorkshire Police. We work very closely with them on many fires, certainly when we think that, or it's likely that there may have been a crime committed, and that can be, fires sometimes used as a way of covering up another crime, or it can be a crime in its own right, and I'll cover that a little bit later on. Or if there's been a fatality. So if there is unfortunately a fatal fire, that is then automatically classed as a crime scene, and we would work very much with what's called an SAO, a senior investigating officer from North Yorkshire Police, and we would conduct a joint investigation, but very much like led, well, joined up between us to make sure that we do it in the right way, the right order, all the right things are being considered. I've touched on insurance companies already. Large organisations may want to undertake their own investigation, and the health and safety executives. So any work-related sort of serious injury and fire that's related to fire will involve the HSE as well. And that's not an exhaustive list, it's just an indicative list of the kind of organisations that undertake fire investigation.
Sorry, what would be the kind of criteria that would, because I think it's fair to say that it's not always a fire investigator that goes out, is it? Sometimes the investigation is done by the crew that are at the scene.
So we're going to cover that in the next slide, actually, Tom, if that's okay. Yeah. So in terms of cost of fire, well, I've mentioned a couple of times already, unfortunately, fires can lead to people losing lives. So at the top of the hierarchy there, I've referenced the fact that loss of life is one of the ultimate costs of fire. But you'll see on this slide a number of pictures and a short list. Obviously, fires do have a very significant impact on the economy and business loss. We've experienced, serious fires in businesses, some of which have not been able to recover. But also, going back to my previous comments, we've been able to engage with businesses in part of that recovery programme, and our protection teams certainly have worked alongside businesses to try to get them as quickly as possible back up to an operating model, which is where I think we can really contribute in terms of business engagement. Obviously, there can be a tremendous societal risk. So the bottom left there is a picture of a school fire. You can imagine if you lose a school, the loss to society in the local area is huge. What I would like to say at this particular point is that fires in educational establishments in North Yorkshire are actually quite rare. They do occasionally happen, but thankfully not very often. The last figure that was reported by what's called the Association of British Insurers was released in 2018, and they stated that they paid out about £1.3 billion on domestic fire damage alone. But the actual real loss of fire to society was estimated around about the 11.5 to 12 billion pound range. So obviously we can attribute or we can identify what's been paid out by insurance companies, but what's hard to understand is the significant loss to individuals and other people as a result of that fire, like, for example, having to people losing jobs and having to relocate, etc. So what I would just like to say here is that fire can have a very huge financial cost on the community. And then also, I've mentioned heritage in terms of built, but not forgetting, of course, the natural heritage. So the top right shows basically a picture of moorland fires. These, I'd just like to, if I may, make a point. It's been shown recently on the news that we're starting to see an increase in some wildfires around the country. We've not had a particular big issue in North Yorkshire recently, but we are anticipating a very hot, dry summer this year. And I would just like to stress the point that, care should be taken when people are out enjoying these beautiful places in the county, but be very vigilant about things like use of barbecues, etc. So I'm going to move across to my colleague Pete now, who's now going to explain a little bit about the fire investigation process.
Dave, good afternoon, everyone. So, Tom, some of these questions that you've asked before may well lap over in the next part of the presentation that you've already mentioned at the time. So, the question at the top there is, what do we actually do? The schematic, the picture there is a nice to have, and that would be in the ideal world. But as you saw on the previous slide, the devastation on some fires, it's not quite as simple as that. It's not just in one compartment, and you're trying to work out where what we call the area of origin is of a fire. When there's a large devastation, it can be very difficult to actually ascertain where that compartment might actually even be. And that's quite often the problem, but we would use lots of different methods and ways of trying to determine where the area of origin actually is. And then the part the schematic's trying to show is that you would hone into that particular area to then allow us to find the actual cause of the fire. Now that's, again, it can be quite difficult. You probably saw on the previous slides with some real life pictures of investigation that's going on when you've got the devastation, the fire damage, the heat damage, the smoke damage to a compartment. It's actually sometimes harder to work out what items are actually involved in that fire scene. And some of it is actually difficult in working out what those things are. It does work very much on the basis of elimination and credibility of ignition sources that are actually inside to come to that resolve of what we actually think the cause actually is, or the potentials. So there is a systematic, methodical way of going through that at the time. We then, this has been mentioned already about the development of fires, and it's quite important to have an understanding to build up a picture of why a fire has developed as it has. And that can be through quite a lot of different reasons. It could be through ventilation patterns, it could be down to the intervention of the fire crews while they go into the scene and are actually dealing with the scene. And again, that has an automatic effect on trying to work out the cause and sometimes the origin as well. So sometimes it requires questioning of the fire crews, their activities, what they did, what they achieved, what they saw, what they heard. It's also building up a picture from any other witnesses that might be close by to help on that side. So the development is really important because it does have an impact definitely on the outcomes of the investigation. So we do this in a very much a joined up approach. It's not, as Dave mentioned previously, it's not about us alone. It's normally a joint venture with a few other organisations that normally would have an interest or a stakeholder interest within a scene at the time, and it's good practice to have a strategy, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on a case study a little bit later on in the presentation of how we would go around investigating fires in a joint venture as we move onwards. So it's quite important that we do look at scenes in a preliminary investigation style to start with, and then go into more detailed excavation activity, which again is what that picture is showing, to determine what is the cause and what's likely to have happened. It's quite a complex scene, as you can imagine. If you're in a dark environment, and as I said before, that you've got items that you can't really work out what they actually are at the time. The hazardness of the scene itself, so the right PPE is required, that we've got the right equipment to determine what's actually happened at that time. Would you like to move the screen of the slide on, please, Dave? Thank you. So this slide here is going to a little bit of detail about what we must do and what we teach our investigators to consider at all times. The first point really is going through if we feel that the incident and the scene is not accidental. I mean, we're thinking this is a deliberate scene, and that needs to be recorded in the different mechanisms that we would have. So scene notes are primitively used at the time. Reporting mechanisms, we've touched on a couple of those already, and then that would need to go towards the police if we felt that is of a deliberate nature, and that's where the joined up approach would need to be coming in. The Fire and Rescue Act gives certain powers, which is on the next slide in a bit more detail, to investigate fires. But there is also special considerations beyond our powers, that we don't have the ability to assist in certain deliberate fires. That's where we would very much lean on our colleagues in the police to get those powers. An example of that might be for CCTV, where we would request that from a third party involvement and utilise that to assist with the investigation. It wouldn't necessarily be for any of the criminal side, but it would be for investigating the fire itself and going back to the area of the origin and the cause. Go on to the next slide, please, Dave. So those powers I've just mentioned on the Fire and Rescue Services Act are the sections 45 and 46. And I think it's quite important just in the bold there that these are powers and they're not duties to investigate the fires. And so those powers are quite hintily down there with what we can and what we can't do. With the supplementary powers, we're talking more about articles that might be inside a particular premises that we're investigating, that we might need to either retrieve, take images of, without necessarily always having the permission from the responsible person inside those premises. But again, at the bottom there, it's got the investigators investigating the cause of the fire rather than conducting any criminal investigation. But again, it's the joined up approach. The evidence would be used for prosecution purposes in a bundle down the line. So it is that we do work very closely with the police when we're investigating these fires along with. Next one, Dave, please. This is a little bit harder to see, so I apologise that the print might be a little bit smaller you can see, but this slide is going into what we call the levels, or now commonly known as the tiers of investigation and investigators. So Tom mentioned previously about the fire crews investigating fires, and what this is showing is the different levels of responsibility for the different levels or the different tiers of investigation that we have. So the tier ones, this is applicable to all fire incidents. So it would always start with a tier 1 investigation, and then it may go forwards to a tier 2 or a tier 2 regional investigation, depending on the nature of that type of incident that's been attended. So within there, this is the supervisory managers, also known as the crew or the watch managers on the fire engines, those that are in charge of the fire engines, to look and try to identify with the first form of investigation if they feel that this is a deliberate and accidental, or as it says there, unknown or undetermined fire. At that point, if they have any suspicion, we have a procedure in place where they can initially call for further assistance, and that might be a verbal assistance with an on-duty tier 2 investigator, or it could be that the investigator comes out and it feels that the need to actually come out to the scene, have a thorough look and do a full tier 2 investigation. There's reference a couple of times on the types of incident to primary fires. Now these are fires which are potentially could harm people or cause damage to property, and that doesn't actually mean derelict properties. That's the exception to that particular part there of primary fires. But it could also be vehicles, some outside structures. It certainly involves fatalities or any casualties that might be involved in any fires or rescues. It also mentions there about what we call a predetermined attendance to any types of incidents, which is from anything more than 5 fire engines attending an incident. Would certainly a primary fire would certainly invoke our control room to request the nearest fire scene investigator of a tier 2 investigator to come out to that one. The difference between the tier 2 investigators and the tier 2 regional investigators is a really good point just to make sure that you have awareness on this one. Is there's a smaller cadre of personnel, and in a regional collaboration that we have with all of Yorkshire, is that we have a minimum of 2 tier 2 regional investigators available per service. So we have a total of 8 that can be called upon on a rota system, so outside of normal working hours, where they can come and support a tier 2 investigator. These are normally at fatal fires, or if you can see on the list, if you can make that out, there's a death of a firefighter, serious injuries sustained, or if it's a very large incident, such as more than 10 fire engines that are attending an incident, or where there's persons trapped in a collapsed building, CBR incidents, which are terrorist-based incidents that would also invoke that response. Again, the main difference being they are existing tier 2 investigators. They have a little bit more experience, more academic qualification behind it, but more importantly, it's having the understanding of a collaborative approach and making sure that the strategies that are put in place are appropriate to that particular scene. So that might be a forensic strategy, or it might be an investigative strategy. And it's having a look at primacy amongst those that are attending. Normally that would be the police, but it could be other investigators that Dave's already mentioned. So it could be insurance investigators, forensic investigators that are coming out. So it's just ensuring that everything is dealt with in an appropriate joined up approach, sharing information, sharing risk information, making sure that all details are passed according between all parties at that point. Is there any questions regarding anything to do with the levels of a fire investigation? No.
I think so. Oh,
Caroline's
got one for you.
Thanks. I'm sorry if this is a bit of an obvious question. Just on the tier 2 for regional investigations, Do you get like a specialism within that? So just appreciating, say, for North Yorkshire with our rurality and just looking kind of regionally of where you may have fires more specific for, say, farming community. You know, is there then people who have particular themes because they lead on a particular area, they've got more experience in that area?
Not really, Caroline, as such. The people that are on the tier 2 are very experienced generally. They have done different studies, thesis, if you like, in academia, but they do tend to use. It's a really good question, actually, because if you can imagine the ruralness that we do have in North Yorkshire and then compare that to West Yorkshire, where the dynamics are quite considerably different, and the exposure, I think, is what you're alluding to there for the different types of incident that we would have. I'm not aware that there would be any particular specialism. Dave, is there anything that you can add to that from the cadre I can think of? Not particularly.
I think the answer really, it's about the support you can give to the investigation. So where you talk, Pete, about providing that strategic understanding, that awareness, that collaborative thing. Basically, all fire investigations that we undertake, they follow what's called a scientific method. It's a very sort of easy to, once you get familiar with it, but basically it's all about, as Pete said, you find information, you analyse the evidence, you in effect create a hypothesis, and then you challenge the hypothesis. And if you work that through in a very logical way, more often than not, you get to what you can class as a very sort of like credible hypothesis. There's always the caveat that with more information that comes in, you might want to reconsider that, but you know, it's about that particular level, about overseeing the investigation, making sure you've got the right people, the right resources, the right approach to the investigation. That's what the tier 2 regional comes in. Inevitably, there will be certain fires that perhaps individuals will have had either more interest in, or they've got, especially so electrical fires, for example, is quite a niche area. We can all do them, but there are some people who will perhaps specialise in that and can take it on. What fire and rescue services do, we do what's called fire scene investigation. When I talk about things like the insurance companies, they can take our findings and then go much further. So they will take that and do the X-ray. They will do the deconstruction of equipment. They will look at it under microscopy for really, really fine detail. So hopefully that answers your question, Caroline.
Yeah, just one more to add to that, Caroline, actually, just while David was talking there, that the tier 2s aren't taking over necessarily the incident in the neighbouring county. We would also have a minimum of one tier 2 investigator who would be local to that region. So it's not somebody to take over, it's to supplement and support that investigator that's there at that time. Okay.
Can I ask a further question on that then, please? So, do we have enough resource and expertise at each level to meet the demand?
We're going to go on to the demand in a moment, so we can look at that.
Okay.
With the resource that we do have, just to give you, it's probably a right time to give you the flair of what resources we do have. We have a cadre of 8 competent officers that would be available any given time, 24/7, 7 days a week, 24 hours, 7 days a week. And in that's going to lead on to this one a little bit that Dave's just put onto the screen, because there is quite a good breakdown of time. And one of the questions that I think may come from this is when you look at that, and it's in very small to see what that pie is actually indicating there, but the grey area is showing travel. Now, with the geographical areas that we do have, for example, I live in York, and when I'm covering near enough the whole county, so, and outside of the county as well, potentially. So travel does account for quite a large chunk, as you can see, of time going to these different incidents. And quite often not, we would go out once on the initial call. So for example, if it was 2 o'clock in the morning, we were called out. We would do an initial preliminary investigation and then come back to the site sometime later that morning in daylight hours and go back. So therefore, you know, the travel will be quite substantial. The large chunk that you can see in there is the investigation time. So that does account for quite a large percentage of the physical investigation at the scene looking at lots of different areas, going into depth. Excavation takes quite a long time to be able to do, depending on the nature of the type of premises that we might be looking at the time. And we've got the blue section there, the smaller section, which is looking at the documentation side, the administration. So again, this is down to reporting. There's different categories of reports that we would put forward to other interested parties or submit nationally. As David mentioned before about the IRS is a national reporting system, but we'd also supply possibly statements to the police if that was required. It could be if it was a fatal fire or it's a fire that's likely to go through the criminal system process, then it would be also a quite an in-depth report that we would put forward for witness expert witness testimony, or through to the coroner's court and to actually present at the coroner's court as well. So that does take a considerable amount of our time. And then the very small chunk, again, sorry, it's a bit hard to see on the words, is a third-party interviews. Now that is becoming, I think, slightly a bigger part of the chart there as we move onwards, purely because investigators are becoming more and more involved in fires now through the insurance industry, and we are getting quite a few requests to have interviews with those directly of our findings to help them with their findings. And as Dave mentioned before, we've got a very good rapport with quite a few of the national insurance investigators, and that's twofold, that we work both ways with that, with sharing information. So that's a bit of a breakdown with the pie that you can see on that chart there. The chart to the right is just giving an idea of the annualized hours over the last 5 years. I have got some figures as a comparison to this year as well, actually, where we're at, even though we're on just coming up to 4 months. But that equates to a peak in actually sort of 10 to 14 weeks worth of time that it takes that relatively small cadre of resource to do the investigations. And this is purely for the tier 2. This isn't the tier 1 investigations, which are with the operational crews. So it is quite a resource intense activity. Currently this year, if I can just mention, elaborate on the 2021 figures, so it gives you a bit of gravity. We're looking at around about 60 incidents that we attended on a tier 2 basis. So far this year, we've attended half of that, 31 incidents so far this year, and that's accounting to about 324 hours so far. Now, this is the question from Julie at the beginning about trends. Is quite relevant here. So we do analyse this information, looking for trends amongst the tier 2 cadre at the types of incidents to see if there is a trend that we need to follow. In recent times, just to elaborate a little bit on Dave's comments before, lithium batteries is one that has been known to be a cause nationally as well as regionally and locally. So we do have continual professional development with our team to ensure, and our tier 1 officers as well, to give them information and advice what to look for on certain pieces of information. So when I went back to the beginning of my part of the presentation about it's sometimes difficult to ascertain what is involved in a fire because it's badly affected by fire damage or heat damage, is to look for these as potential trends and go forward, and then linking that in with prevention activity and even down to the lines of trading standards activity as well. The line. Okay, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah. Pete's taken us to the point basically where we go through what the investigation is, who does it, what we need. Quite often there is post-investigation work. We've mentioned a couple of times already both the criminal court and the coroner's inquest or coroner's courts, coronial inquiries. Fire investigations, or fire investigators who form part of the tier 2 team can be considered to be in a place where they can provide expert evidence. They can be classed as an expert witness. I'll explain what that means in a second. what we're going to do now is quite quickly run through what we do post-incident, and I'll refer to some of the guidance and the codes that we're now working towards, just to give you a flavour of where fire investigation is at and is going on a national level, and how we as a fire service are responding to that. So being an expert requires you to have special knowledge. So in answer to your question, Caroline, yes, we have got a specialism. We are classed as forensic investigators in this area of work, the fire scene investigation. Some of us will have perhaps more of an interest in certain types of fire because we've either done more of them, or we've got a particular interest in them, or we've studied them at an academic level. But ultimately, we can use that to present our findings in places where they can be subject to extremely high levels of scrutiny, i.e. in the court. So if we're going to operate in that environment as an expert witness, it's just important that as a service and as an individual in the team, we understand clearly what our roles are. So the expert witness, the function, the purpose is to help the court understand complex and technical evidence. In other words, it's for us to interpret and make sense of things that are quite often not a layperson's normal thing that they would be around and talking about. So turning things that are complicated into something that's quite simple and easy to understand. It's about being able to provide information that allows the independent judgment of facts. Okay, so it's being unbiased, providing an opinion. We're entitled to provide an expert opinion based on what we see. So we see evidence, we see factual things, and we can interpret that and say, based on these things, I am of the opinion that this is the cause of a fire. In court, it's interesting, as a witness, you are entitled to listen to the other witness evidence being given. And increasingly, what the courts like to see now is that you work with, in effect, defence witnesses outside of the court itself to actually agree on the points that are going to be raised within the trial. So quite often we will have contact with defence experts, and they will be basically looking at our report. Quite often they've not been to the scene, they're looking at our investigation report, they will have questions around it, and we will explain how we got to that point and provide the necessary information to them, ideally to get to the point where we agree before we go into court. And if we don't, then we can explain to the court why that is. When it comes to the crime, Pete or one of us said earlier on that we don't investigate the crime. Well, we do contribute to a criminal investigation. The arson itself is the crime. We've talked about a finding from a fire investigation of it being deliberate. Not all deliberate fires are crimes. Not all deliberate fires are set with the intention of doing what it says on this definition here. So if it meets that definition, that is when it will be undertaken as an investigation by, in this case, the police, to look at that and pursue that through an investigation, potentially leading through to a prosecution against that crime. It's a very serious crime. It potentially carries a life sentence. We've contributed to quite a lot of investigations over many years where the police have successfully taken prosecutions to court and people have been sentenced to a custodial sentence. We're not always expected to attend court. Sometimes our statement is or our report is sufficient, and quite often there is other evidence that is gathered as part of the investigation, which basically then is even stronger and more substantial as part of that investigation. So it's just to say that there is a difference between deliberate and arson. Arson has to have that intent to cause damage and harm. So I'm just going to pass over to Peter now, who's going to just run through a short case study which illustrates the point how we do work with, in this case, the police on this type of incident.
Pete and Dave, we're running quite over at the moment, so if you could If you could gallop through this last bit, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I shall run through this very quickly. It is very short, this one. So this is just to, as Dave mentioned, it's about the joined up approach that we used with North Yorkshire Police and the CSIs for a forensic strategy at this particular premises in York. Actually, we called to this one the early hours where an individual or individuals unknown had escaped through a ground floor window, and there was smoke that ensued from that particular premises. So if we can move on to the next slide, Dave, please. When we had a preliminary investigation, having a very brief look around and joining up the strategy put together, we could see that there were signs of other potential crimes which may or may not have been masking the fire. So it was just that question of the deliberate intent behind that particular fire itself. There was signs of forced entry, unusual occurrences inside the premises, but it resulted in what looked like a bedroom that had a fire within that particular compartment. There was signs, as you can see on the right hand side, of drug use as well within that. So it was quite important that we used this strategy to join up and who had premises to look at what was actually involved. It was quite a jigsaw, if you like, of different events inside this particular flat. And it was quite confusing, to say the least, of what actually had happened in the sequence of events. So again, on to the next slide, please, Dave. And what we did discover within the bedroom, and the image to the left-hand side there, which is actually a wooden bed frame from the larger previous picture, just in before the image, was a bedside cabinet that was in the gap to the side. And underneath that gap, which is the picture on the right-hand side, was a sample of carpet, which indicated that there had been some accelerant use within that particular compartment. And that was detected by a handheld, what we call a VOC detector, volatile organic compound detector, which indicated a very large substantial hit of accelerant within that. So we worked in partnership with the CSIs and the powers, that are supplementary powers that we talked about previously, with the police to take and analyse that sample to ensure that we could actually work out what accelerant was used at that time to show that there was a deliberate intent, particularly within that bedroom. Just the other points on that slide there is just showing that the gathering of that evidence and the fire reports that we put together, either in the scope of witness statements or through the IRS, is another way of trending particular types of fires. This one being deliberate, but if it was accidental, that's the mechanism that we would generally lose. And the small part just to the bottom left, which is to do with the Forensic Capability Network, and working in conjunction with them through the CSIs in the future for reporting, is a new way, a new streamlining process that we're embarking on, which is a national trend and a local trend, which I'm hoping to get into place certainly within the next month or so. Thank you, Dave.
Okay, so I will be quick with these next few slides, Commissioner. We talked a little bit earlier on about what is now emerging and directing the work of fire investigation for not just fire and rescue services, but those involved in this case, any forensic science or fire investigation work that leads to the criminal justice system. There is a code of practice now in place for the investigation of fires and explosions for that justice system. What that basically provides is information for investigators on the appropriate knowledge understanding required to undertake such investigations. It helps us to understand the approach of how we engage in that investigative process, which Pete's outlined already. It sets out recommendations for how we should look to identify, record, recover, interpret, present evidence that we've found as part of the investigation, and it also covers any of the legal requirements that are required for anybody working in the criminal justice system. So in terms of competence, this is defined within a competency framework that the code has got to sort of set the direction for this. what's called the National Fire Chiefs Council have drafted or have produced a competency framework which we North Yorkshire comply with. So in effect, all of our Tier 2, our specialist fire investigations, are qualified to a degree level qualification in fire scene investigation or higher. They have all undertaken what's called the Advanced Professional Award in being an expert witness. They receive continual professional development. Pete runs a CPD programme for all of the team to be involved with. Our work is subject to peer review, both internally and externally, and that does feed into a quality assurance programme. So basically we are making sure that we are doing things as our policies and procedures and the codes require us to do. We do have the regional team, which Pete's talked about, and there is a memorandum of understanding within that, which sets out even further what levels of training, competence, experience are required to form part of that Tier 2 team. And quite recently, the NFCC have also released what are called the fire standards in fire investigation, which have basically been cross-mapped to all of our policies and procedures. All of that, I suppose, really paves the way to the final part, which is just to talk about something called an ISO 17020. This is a standard that is organisations can be accredited to have this standard by something called UCAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. The forensic regulator has imposed a requirement for anybody who's operating in the criminal justice system to have the accreditation to this standard. And it's an inspection standard. What it's there to do, as it says, is to basically create a system within the organisation that you can demonstrate the consistency in how you go about undertaking your investigations. It's the closest standard that UCAS have towards investigation. So on a national scale, just to give you a picture of what's going on, a number of services are looking at doing it by developing their own what's called quality management system. A number are looking to collaborate between themselves. Some have decided they're not going to go for accreditation. The most notable, I think, would be London Fire Brigade, who've said that they're not going to go for accreditation. And then the other half of the fire service in the country are looking at various other collaboration arrangements with policing. We in North Yorkshire have done a lot of work preparing ourselves for accreditation. We've had staff trained on the ISO standard auditors course. Pete's been heavily involved in doing some of the preliminary work nationally in terms of around some of the competencies and the quality assurance frameworks. And as a region, we've worked for a couple of years now looking at how we could design and develop a quality management system that we could then align our policies and procedures to, which is what we'd have to have in place to then go for our accreditation. So there's a lot of work being done to date. There's still a lot of work to do for us. We are at the point where we're doing some further research into the most suitable approach for North Yorkshire Fire Service, and we will be looking to present papers to what's called Executive Board in May. So on that point, that brings us to the end of our presentation. I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a rush towards the end and for the time taken. Tom, I can see you've got a hand up.
Just a really quick one, if I may. Just on your not quite penultimate slide around competence. What is the service doing to develop interest and expertise and to succession plan around fire investigators, please? Just very aware, obviously, of the retirement profile within the service. How are we ensuring that we are developing people into these roles going forwards? So
the Tier 2 team is part of, they are members of what we call our flexi duty. So they are station managers and some group managers, and fire investigations, basically what we call an attribute. It's a specialism that is given to people as part of that flexi duty role. When we come to give those specialisms out, and there are others like being a hazmat officer, for example, we do consider their sort of areas of experience and expertise they've had in other departments. So quite a lot of the fire investigation officers have come through a fire safety background. mainly because they've had that awareness and training around buildings, and that leads into what we talked before about fire spread, development, growth. But also they have a lot of experience of working in investigative practice. So we do look at that, and we do link that decision, I suppose, really towards the competencies. What we are in the throes of doing, though, is we recognise that we need to do more with our tier 1 investigators. So we've invested quite heavily in virtual reality equipment. We're looking to launch a training programme to better support basically our crew watch managers, and as part of that, that's where it starts. We will give them better information, training, support, guidance, and then as those individuals, if they choose to, want to promote themselves and get further on the organisation, we will look at who they are and again develop them. So there is in the background, Tom, a pretty robust selection process, but also a development programme where they're aligned to a mentor. They go through a workbook. They get academic qualifications, and they're continually supported through CPD.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Dave and Pete for that presentation. It was very informative. Thank you. So we'll come to agenda item 7, which is the North Yorkshire Fire Service performance update by James Mannering.
Commissioner, I'll just bring it on screen. Okay, could everybody see that?
Can see it, but we're struggling to hear you, James.
Okay, I had this problem earlier. Bear with me. Let me see if I can.
Oh, no, that's better now.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I'm going to take you through the performance pack for this month. I'll start off with our demand to the service, which is demonstrated in this slide, the first 3 months of the year, and then compared against the same time period in the past 2 previous years. And what I'll draw your attention to is that bottom left-hand corner, where we've got 2022 in the orange special service increase. And I'd like to explain a bit around why that is. So what we experienced at the beginning of this year were 4 storms, which you'll remember which was Arwen, Dudley, Eunice and Franklin. And what that created was an increase in demand on the service, in particular for unsafe structures. So what that means in practical terms for us is things like roof coverings become unsecure, roof panels, fence panels, trees. These types of things put people in a dangerous situation, and we come out to support the public to make those situations safe. And ultimately, that is what's caused that increase this month. The only other small area of increase that we can touch on is fires in the open. There is no direct correlation or reason that we can attribute to that, but it's something that we'll continue to monitor in the coming months to see if that continues, or whether, again, that just reduces down and it was an anomaly for that particular period of time. I'd like to take us on to false alarms. As we know, they attribute to our largest proportion of demand on the service. And just to remind people, the 3 different types of alarms that we do respond to. So first of all, there's our largest demand, which is false alarm apparatus, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. The second, which you'll see in orange, is false alarm good intent. So that is when people have called the service and with good intentions, believing there's a fire. A good example of that might be that there's steam on a cold night, that somebody's perceived to be smoke, and after investigation, that is turned out not to be the case. And then finally, not to be complacent with our smaller number of deliberate fires. And again, we'll come on to those, if I can, into this month's statistics. So this breaks down our March statistics, and I say I'll take us straight back to that malicious calls, malicious activations area, and digging into that has increased only marginally. What that means in practical terms is 3 calls, but what we've identified from that, they are all break glass point activations. So that is where we've got those little red boxes that you see in buildings when you're exiting the building with a piece of glass in there that you break on the way out. That's what they're for, and people have activated those maliciously. And what we're doing with those is engaging with the responsible people on those premises in the first instance to see if, first of all, they're located in the right locations and whether we can help in any way. And any other solutions around, there are things like covers that can be used where there's evidence there that actually says it acts as a deterrent, but also doesn't delay an alarm being activated if we need to. But obviously one of the most important areas there is the offenders themselves, and that we work obviously closely with our police colleagues on that and share information to take action in those instances. Again, this is something that we haven't seen in previous months, and we're going to be keeping a close eye on, and indeed those particular cases, we'll see those through to see if there's any action that we can take on there.
James, can I ask a question, please, on the false alarms? And
yes,
they're always quite high, and I just wondered, what are we going to do to seek to reduce and manage the number of false alarms?
Yes, so that's a great question, and again, it's absolutely at the forefront of our priorities. And what I can say is that this month we're actually released a new process, which is a 4-tiered process, which is giving crews a greater guidance. Well, not just crews, but the approach, a greater consistency of how we tackle these things. So we've made it really robust in that first engagement with our crews of how they are to relate to the responsible person. So there's some guidance around that we are passing on in the first instance to really nip that in the bud where we can, and to take action in that very first instance while our crews are already there, they've already made that journey and they've already invested their time. Then they're engaging with that responsible person and leaving them with what we're calling a postcard with key messages on there of how they can prevent a reoccurrence. The second stage that goes on from there is, again, further engagement, but also a formalised letter from us with a guidance booklet with, again, much more detailed guidance around that. And we'll start to involve our fire safety team, who've got expertise in the legislative side to warm them up to any potential concerns that we may have with regards to that. The third section third phase would be for that specialist team to do a fire safety audit under the regulatory reform fire safety order. So again, we're looking at once we've reached that stage of coming to the conclusion that that particular premises is not satisfying its obligations with regards to fire safety management. And then that final and fourth stage would be enforcement action against those particular premises. And that is something that we have in place or will be in place in the next few months. And also we've introduced a form when those initial crews arrive to gain further information and analysis for now allow us to look at other solutions that we might be able to explore and target more specifically at certain trends that we identify and improve that. That's just what we're doing now, but the thing that we want to come on to and we're going to move on to is going to be talked about in more detail next month at PAM through the response and resource model through the Chief Fire Officer. And he's going to outline some further measures there. Again, things that we're exploring around the types of premises we respond to, the times of day, and the type of response that we provide to certain premises. But again, you'll get more information on that next time.
Thank you.
James, I wonder whether we might skip through to the overall fire cover slide, perhaps, just aware of the time, and obviously there's a something to pick up on there, I think.
Yeah,
thanks.
Absolutely. Well, I'll very quickly mention absence rates in short-term short-term absences have slightly increased, and that is due to the COVID trend, both in the community, local community, and the national trend that mirrored, and that played a small part in some of the factors with cover, but it's certainly notable because there are people on dual contracts that this did affect and has had an effect on our availability. I say it's not just unique to that. We have a number of people who have some short-term employment changes where they have left the area for a number of months and will be returning, and that has affected particularly our junior officer group. So those are the people who go out in charge of the fire engine, fire appliance, sorry, and also are in charge of incidents. So they have the requisite skills to do that. And they are a particular group that were affected by both of those two areas and have caused a reduction in availability this month. Obviously, things that we're doing around availability to increase it is we have an on-call course planned for May, where we have a number of individuals that will be going through that, which will increase those numbers. But it's important to recognise that that whole recruitment process very much focuses on availability when and where we need it, and we'll talk a bit about that on the next slide.
So sorry, just for clarity, the increased critical cover levels, then that's due to the on-call availability issue, though?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So this is a breakdown against each of our stations, and again, without being specific on particular areas, this fluctuates up and down as we'll have seen in previous months. But I think the next slide is much more illustrative of what the message that we want to get across here, and to explain the demand versus our availability. And I think this is really interesting, and this was something that was requested, I believe, last month. And what this shows us is the exactly that. The blue areas are our availability, and that orange line there is our incident demand over a 24-hour period, and that is broken down from January to March this year. And what you'll notice there is our demand is where we have our lowest on-call availability. Let's remember also that we are very much shifting to a prevention focus, and that is our intent, and that the hours that falls across is very much, again, the hours where we'd be looking to engage with people in those preventative measures. So just coming back then a step to what I was just talking about about that process for recruiting on-call colleagues, then we prioritise availability during those times where we need it most, which is the hours that you see in front of you. We're also trying to streamline that process as much as possible to ensure that we're getting people through it and have the best possible experience as they're going through that. So we have the same number of, or a very close number of people that started the process to then finishing it, because from our feedback, we recognise that is one of the areas where we lose people, is the time that it takes. And we really have put a lot of effort into that in the last few months, and continue to make sure that we improve in that area. But this is exactly the data that we are using to inform the risk and resource model, which again will be talked about in more detail again next month. But this is exactly the type of data that we used to inform that, to ensure that our availability is when we need it and where we need it. And that really sort of illustrates it within this graph here.
And sorry, James, just another clarity. This is post cover moves as well, isn't it? I think in the same as the previous chart.
It is. Apologies to skim over that last slide.
That's fine.
Quickly. But absolutely, yes. So this is something that is post cover moves. So for those that aren't aware what that is we have availability across our on-call staff, and then we deploy resources through various different means to supplement that, to bring availability back up, to provide a balanced fire cover across North Yorkshire and the City of York. And what this is after those moves have been made. So what we're working on is the data to look at pre-moves, The challenge we have around that at the moment is that the system that we use is very much from a spreadsheet, and it's a manual process, and we have been working to secure an upgrade to what's our vision software system, which is in fire control, which will allow this information to be directly put into that system and allow us to run reports from various different points much more easily and less onerously. And that's what we continue to work on, not only to improve the experience for our on-call colleagues, but also to be able to just demonstrate that better to the public and to yourselves, Commissioner.
Yeah.
So moving on, a really good positive 2 slides, I feel, here. This really demonstrates the work that has gone into both prevention and protection, starting with protection on this slide. So it demonstrates the activity of the last 12 months on the left-hand side, and then those 4 smaller diagrams on or bar charts on the right-hand side demonstrate the last 3 months. And what you'll see across the board there is an increase in activity, which is really positive and absolutely follows the intent of our drive to move to more of a preventative and increase that prevention and protection areas. So as we know, we've had an increase in protection through the Uplift grant, which again we can see start to playing out in the lighter blue areas there. And if I particularly bring your attention to the bottom right hand box, which talks about our regulatory activity. So regulatory activity is our fire safety audits. We prioritise those audits based on the highest risks within North Yorkshire and the City of York. The highest complexity ones will be done by our most highly qualified people, who are fire safety specialists in light blue. But pleasingly, in the dark blue, our operational staff, who deal with high risk but that medium to low risk complexity, have significantly increased their work in that area, and which is really pleasing to see. Moving on to prevention, again, is a real good news story in this regard. So again, you'll see a real uplift in the amount of activity that has taken place. But if I can particularly draw your attention to home safety and safe and well, and who has done that activity. So you'll see in the dark blue on that over the last 12 months, the home safety proportion has been largely with our frontline staff, our operational staff, which is again exactly our intent. If we look across to the safe and well activity as part of that, again, month on month, we are seeing an increase. And what we can attribute that to is the prevention team have upskilled our workforce out on some on-call.